Hey guys, welcome back. And tonight, we're going to settle in with some wonderfully mundane details about the Roman Colosseum, its spectacles, its strange little administrative quirks, and all the cultural bits and pieces that surrounded it. So just get comfortable, let your eyes close whenever they feel heavy, and let the slow, steady rhythm of ancient history carry you gently off to sleep. There's no need to remember any of this. There's no quiz at the end. Just let the words wash over you like a warm, comfortable blanket, and we'll wander together through the dusty corridors of the past. Now, when most people think of the Roman Colosseum, they think of dramatic gladiatorial combat, two evenly matched warriors squaring off in a battle to the death. And while that certainly happened from time to time, the reality of what took place inside that enormous amphitheater was far more varied, far more strange, and honestly, far more lopsided than popular imagination tends to suggest. The matches held in the Colosseum were, more often than not, profoundly unfair. They were designed that way. The Romans didn't always want a fair fight. Sometimes they wanted a spectacle, and a spectacle doesn't necessarily require two equally capable opponents. Sometimes it just requires one very dangerous situation and a lot of sand to soak up the aftermath. Let's start with the building itself, because even the construction of the Colosseum has a kind of plodding, bureaucratic quality to it that makes for perfectly soothing bedtime material. The Flavian Amphitheater, which is the proper name for the Colosseum, was begun under the Emperor Vespasian around 70 to 72 AD. Vespasian was a practical sort of emperor, not particularly flashy, not particularly dramatic, just a competent administrator who had come to power after the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors. He decided that the best way to win the favor of the Roman people was to give them a grand new venue for public entertainment, built on the site of the artificial lake that had been part of Nero's extravagant Golden House complex. There was a certain political symbolism in that choice, of course. Nero had taken public land for his private pleasure. Vespasian was giving it back to the people. But beyond the symbolism, there was simply the enormous logistical challenge of building the thing. The Colosseum is an elliptical structure measuring roughly 189 meters long, 156 meters wide, and about 48 meters tall at its highest point. It could seat somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, depending on whose estimate you trust. And every one of those seats had to be carefully planned and assigned according to social rank. The construction involved enormous quantities of travertine limestone, which was quarried from Tivoli, about 20 miles outside of Rome, and transported to the building site along specially constructed roads. The stones were held together not with mortar, but with iron clamps, and it has been estimated that something like 300 tons of iron were used in the construction. Later, many of those iron clamps were removed and repurposed, which is why the exterior of the Colosseum today is pockmarked with small holes where the clamps used to be. But that's a detail for another time. Vespasian didn't live to see the Colosseum completed. He died in 79 AD, and the project was finished under his son Titus, who inaugurated the amphitheater with a spectacular series of games in 80 AD. The inaugural games reportedly lasted for about 100 days, though the ancient sources are not entirely consistent on this point, and during that time, thousands of animals were killed and numerous gladiatorial combats took place. Some sources claim that 9,000 animals were killed during the inaugural games, though that number may be exaggerated. Ancient historians had a tendency to inflate figures for dramatic effect, and we should probably take such numbers with a grain of salt. But even if the real number was half that, it was still an astonishing quantity of animal slaughter, and it gives you some sense of the scale on which these events were conducted. Now, let's talk about the unfair matches, because this is where things get interesting, in a slow, meandering sort of way. The Romans had a whole vocabulary for the different types of spectacles that took place in the amphitheater, and not all of them were what we would think of as gladiatorial combat. There were the munera, which were the actual gladiatorial fights, and then there were the venationes, which were the animal hunts. And then there were the public executions, which were called noxii, referring to the condemned criminals who were put to death in various creative and unpleasant ways. Each of these categories involved its own particular brand of unfairness. Let's start with the venationes, the animal hunts, because these were often the most obviously lopsided events on the program. The venationes typically took place in the morning, before the main gladiatorial bouts, and they involved professional hunters called venatores or bestiarii going up against wild animals that had been imported from all corners of the Roman Empire and beyond. lions from North Africa, bears from the forests of Germania, elephants from the territories bordering the Sahara, crocodiles from Egypt, leopards from the eastern provinces, and all manner of other creatures were captured, transported enormous distances under extremely difficult conditions, and then released into the arena to be killed for the entertainment of the crowd. Now, the unfairness here operated on multiple levels. First, the animals were often weakened, disoriented, and terrified by the time they reached the arena. They had been kept in cramped cages, sometimes for weeks or months, transported in the holds of ships across the Mediterranean, and then kept in the dark, underground passages beneath the Colosseum floor, known as the hypogeum. The hypogeum was an elaborate network of tunnels, holding cells, and mechanical lifts that could raise animals and scenery up to the arena floor through trapdoors. It was an impressive feat of engineering, but for the animals confined within it, it was simply a dark, noisy, confusing maze. By the time they were hoisted up into the blinding sunlight of the arena, with 50,000 screaming spectators surrounding them, many of the animals were too bewildered to put up much of a fight. And even when the animals were in fighting form, the Venatores were typically well-armed and well-trained. They carried spears, bows, and other weapons, and they often fought from behind barriers or on elevated platforms that gave them significant tactical advantages. The animals, meanwhile, were sometimes restrained with ropes or chains, or they were goaded into charging at specific targets using fire or sharp sticks. The whole thing was orchestrated, managed, and controlled to minimize actual risk to the human participants while maximizing the visual drama of the event. It was, in essence, a very elaborate form of stage-managed slaughter, dressed up to look like a dangerous hunt. But the most profoundly unfair spectacles in the Colosseum were probably the executions. The midday program, the part of the day when many wealthier spectators went home for lunch, was often reserved for the killing of condemned criminals. These were people who had been sentenced to death for various crimes, and their executions were turned into public entertainment. The methods varied enormously. Some condemned prisoners were simply thrown into the arena, unarmed, to face wild animals. They had no weapons, no armor, no training, and no chance whatsoever of survival. They were simply there to die, and the only question was how long the process would take and how dramatic it would look. Other executions were more elaborate. The Romans sometimes staged what might be called mythological reenactments, in which condemned prisoners were forced to play the roles of characters from Greek and Roman myths who met unpleasant ends. There are accounts of prisoners being dressed as Orpheus and placed in an arena decorated to look like a forest, complete with trees and artificial rocks, and then wild animals were released to tear them apart, in a grotesque echo of the myth in which Orpheus was killed by Maenads. There are accounts of prisoners being cast as Icarus, fitted with wings, and thrown from a great height. There are accounts of prisoners being forced to reenact the death of Hercules by being burned alive in a tunic soaked in some flammable substance. These were not fights. These were not contests of any kind. They were simply creative methods of public execution, designed to entertain a crowd that had grown accustomed to spectacles of violence and needed ever more novel variations to maintain their interest. And this brings us to an important point about Roman culture and society, which is that the games in the Colosseum were not simply entertainment. They were also a form of social communication, a way for the emperor and the state to demonstrate their power, their generosity, and their authority over life and death. The games were funded by the emperor or by wealthy individuals seeking political favor, and the scale and lavishness of the games was understood as a direct reflection of the sponsor's wealth and importance. A great set of games, with rare and exotic animals, skilled gladiators, and impressive stagecraft, enhanced the reputation of the sponsor. A disappointing set of games could damage it. The seating arrangements in the Colosseum reflected the rigid social hierarchy of Roman society. The best seats, closest to the arena floor, were reserved for senators, who sat on special marble thrones. Behind them sat the equestrians, the Roman knights, who formed the next tier of the social hierarchy. Above them sat the ordinary citizens, arranged according to their social class and occupation. Women, with the exception of the Vestal virgins, who had prime seats near the senators, were generally relegated to the upper tiers. And at the very top, in the nosebleed seats farthest from the action, sat the slaves and the poorest members of the populace. The Colosseum was, in this sense, a kind of architectural diagram of Roman society, with everyone literally placed according to their rank and importance. There was even a complex system of tickets and assigned seating. Spectators received small tokens, probably made of bone or pottery, that indicated their section, row, and seat number. The Colosseum had 76 numbered entrances, plus 4 special entrances reserved for the emperor, senators, magistrates, and the Vestal Virgins. The numbered entrances corresponded to numbered sections of the seating area, and the system was designed to allow tens of thousands of people to enter and exit the building in an orderly fashion. It has been estimated that the Colosseum could be fully emptied in about 15 minutes, which is an impressive feat of crowd management that modern stadium designers still find noteworthy. Now, let's return to the gladiatorial combats themselves, the munera, because even these were often less fair than popular culture would have us believe. Gladiators were trained professionals, and they were expensive. A well-trained gladiator represented a significant investment on the part of his owner, the lanista, who ran the gladiatorial school. Lanisti were not eager to see their valuable property killed, and so the matches were typically arranged with certain safeguards in place. There was a referee, called a summa rudis, who oversaw the fight and could stop it if things got out of hand. There were rules governing what weapons could be used and how the fight should be conducted, and in many cases, the fight did not end in death. If a gladiator was wounded or exhausted, he could appeal for mercy by raising a finger, and the decision about whether to spare or kill him was made by the editor, the sponsor of the games, often with input from the crowd. But here's where the unfairness comes in. The different types of gladiators were deliberately mismatched in terms of their equipment and fighting style, and some of these matchups were inherently more favorable to one side than the other. For example, the retiarius was a type of gladiator who fought with a net, a trident, and a small dagger. He wore almost no armor, just a shoulder guard on his left arm, and he relied on speed and agility to avoid his opponent's attacks. The retiarius was typically matched against the secutor, a heavily armed gladiator with a large rectangular shield, a short sword, and a smooth, rounded helmet designed to prevent the net from catching on it. On paper, this might sound like a balanced matchup, with the lightly armed, mobile fighter against the heavily armed, slower one. But in practice, the secutor's heavy equipment was exhausting to carry, and the smooth helmet severely limited his vision and his ability to breathe. The retiarius, meanwhile, had a significant reach advantage with his trident and could use his net to entangle the secutor's shield or limbs. The matchup was designed to be visually interesting, not necessarily fair. Other gladiatorial types had their own built-in advantages and disadvantages. The Thrakes, or Thracian, carried a small, square shield and a curved sword called a sica, and he typically fought against the Murmillo, who had a larger shield and a straight sword. The Dimicaris fought with 2 swords but no shield. The Eques fought on horseback. The Esidarius fought from a chariot. Each type had its own distinctive equipment, its own fighting techniques, and its own vulnerabilities, and the matchups between them were chosen to create specific kinds of spectacle. Sometimes the matchup clearly favored one fighter over the other, and the crowd understood and appreciated this. Part of the entertainment was seeing how the disadvantaged fighter would cope with his situation. And then there were the truly unfair matches, the ones that were never intended to be contests at all. Sometimes untrained prisoners of war or condemned criminals were given weapons and thrown into the arena against trained gladiators. These were called gregari, and they were essentially cannon fodder. They had no real chance of winning, and everyone knew it. Their purpose was to provide a warm-up act, a kind of bloody appetizer before the main course of the properly matched gladiatorial bouts. The Romans had a term for this kind of spectacle. They called it sine missione, meaning without release, meaning that no one was going to be spared. It was a death sentence, carried out in the form of a fight, and the only suspense was in the details. There were also the mass combats, which could involve dozens or even hundreds of fighters at once. These were staged to recreate famous historical battles, and they were spectacular in scale, but chaotic in execution. In these mass combats, individual skill mattered far less than luck, positioning, and which side happened to have more fighters still standing at any given moment. The participants in these mass combats were often prisoners of war or condemned criminals, and the casualty rate was very high. It was less a sporting event and more a form of organized carnage, and the Romans watched it with the same casual interest that modern audiences might bring to a fireworks display. And this is something worth dwelling on for a moment, in a slow, quiet way, as we settle deeper into our comfortable position and let the weight of the day dissolve. The Roman attitude toward violence was fundamentally different from our own. Not better or worse necessarily, just different. The Romans lived in a world where violence was far more visible, far more present in everyday life, and far more integrated into the normal functioning of society. Public executions were a routine part of the justice system. Military conquests were celebrated with triumphs in which captured enemies were paraded through the streets. The games in the Colosseum were an extension of this culture, a formalized, ritualized, carefully managed presentation of violence that served political, social, and even religious purposes. The Romans did not see the games as barbaric. They saw them as civilized. They saw them as a demonstration of Roman power and Roman order, a way of showing that Rome could command the forces of nature, that it could bring exotic animals from the farthest reaches of the known world and dispose of them at will, that it could decide who lived and who died with a simple gesture of the thumb. And on that thought, let's just pause and breathe for a moment. We've covered quite a bit of ground already, from the construction of the Colosseum to the morning animal hunts, the midday executions, and the afternoon gladiatorial bouts. We've talked about the seating arrangements, the ticketing system, the different types of gladiators, and the deliberately uneven matchups that made the spectacle so varied and so unpredictable. And there's still so much more to explore. So many more quiet, detailed, wonderfully tedious facts about Roman culture and society to carry us gently forward into the night. So let us continue then, at a gentle pace, moving forward through the warm, dusty corridors of Roman life, drifting from the grand spectacle of the arena into the quieter, more mundane details of how people actually lived, how they organized their days, how they fed themselves, and how they navigated the endlessly complex web of social obligations that made up daily existence in the ancient city. There is no rush. There is nowhere we need to be. We are simply wandering through history, letting the facts settle over us like a soft blanket, one layer at a time. Let us begin this next stretch by returning briefly to the Colosseum, because we haven't quite finished with it yet, and there are still a few wonderfully dull details worth mentioning before we move on. One of the things that made the Colosseum such a remarkable feat of engineering, beyond its sheer size and the complexity of its underground passages, was the system known as the velarium. The velarium was an enormous retractable awning made of canvas or possibly linen that could be stretched across the top of the amphitheater to provide shade for the spectators. Imagine that for a moment. An awning large enough to cover an arena that seated somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 people, depending on which estimate you trust. The logistics of deploying such a thing were staggering. The velarium was operated by a detachment of sailors from the Roman naval fleet, specifically sailors from the fleet stationed at Misenum, a port on the Bay of Naples. These sailors were chosen because they had experience handling large sails and rigging, and the velarium functioned essentially like a massive sail. It was attached to a series of tall wooden masts that projected from the top of the Colosseum's outer wall, and ropes ran from these masts to a central ring high above the arena floor. The sailors would haul on the ropes, pulling the canvas panels outward from the center or inward, depending on the position of the sun and the direction of the wind. It was not a perfect system, and there were certainly days when the wind was too strong or the weather too unpredictable for the velarium to be deployed at all. But on those calm, blazingly hot Roman summer days, the awning would have been essential. Without it, the spectators in the upper tiers, who were already the lowest-ranking members of society, would have been exposed to the full force of the Mediterranean sun for hours on end. The fact that the Romans went to such extraordinary lengths to provide shade for the audience tells us something interesting about the nature of these spectacles. They were not merely displays of power or violence. They were carefully managed public events, designed to keep the populace entertained and, more importantly, content. A crowd suffering from heat stroke and sunburn would not have been a happy crowd, and an unhappy crowd could be a dangerous thing in a city as large and as politically volatile as Rome. The velarium was, in its own quiet way, a tool of social control, just as the games themselves were. Keep the people comfortable, keep them fed, keep them entertained, and they would be far less likely to cause trouble. This was the unspoken logic that underpinned so much of Roman public life. Speaking of keeping people fed, let us drift now from the Colosseum to the broader topic of food in ancient Rome, because this is a subject so rich and so detailed and so pleasantly meandering that it could carry us through many quiet hours if we let it. The Romans had a complex and fascinating relationship with food, one that varied enormously depending on social class, geographic location, and historical period. What a wealthy senator ate for dinner in the 1st century was vastly different from what a common laborer consumed, and both were different again from what a soldier stationed on the frontier might have had available to him. For the majority of Romans, the staple food was grain, specifically wheat. Wheat was ground into flour and baked into bread, or it was boiled into a kind of porridge called pulse, which was one of the oldest and most basic Roman foods. Pulse was simple, filling, and cheap, and for centuries it formed the foundation of the Roman diet. In its most basic form, it was just grain and water, cooked slowly until it thickened into a heavy, starchy mass. Sometimes it was flavored with a bit of salt or a drizzle of olive oil, and on better days, it might be enriched with cheese or vegetables or even a small amount of meat. But for many Romans, particularly in the earlier periods of the Republic, pulse was what they ate day after day, meal after meal, and they did not think much of it. It was simply food. It kept them alive and gave them the energy they needed to work. As Rome grew wealthier and more cosmopolitan, the diet of the average citizen became more varied. Bread gradually replaced pulse as the primary source of grain-based nourishment, and bakeries became a common feature of the urban landscape. Professional bakers, known as pastores, operated large commercial bakeries that could produce hundreds of loaves a day, and the bread they made came in a surprising variety of forms. There was coarse brown bread for the poor, finer white bread for the wealthy, and various specialty breads flavored with honey, cheese, or herbs. Archaeologists working at Pompeii have discovered remarkably well-preserved loaves of bread carbonized by the volcanic eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. And these loaves give us a vivid picture of what everyday Roman bread actually looked like. They were typically round, scored into wedges for easy breaking, and roughly the size of a modern dinner plate. The grain that supplied all this bread and porridge was a matter of enormous political and logistical importance. Rome depended heavily on grain imports, particularly from Egypt and North Africa, and the disruption of the grain supply was one of the few things that could genuinely destabilize the city. The annona, or grain dole, was a system by which the Roman state distributed free or subsidized grain to eligible citizens, and it was one of the most important social welfare programs in the ancient world. At its peak, the annona provided grain to several 100,000 people, and managing it was a major administrative undertaking. There were officials responsible for overseeing the shipping, storage, and distribution of the grain, and the warehouses where it was kept, known as horea, were massive structures, some of which have been excavated and studied in considerable detail. The grain ships that carried wheat from Egypt to Rome followed a regular route across the Mediterranean, sailing from Alexandria to the port of Puteoli on the Bay of Naples, or later to Ostia, the port city at the mouth of the Tiber River. These were large vessels, some capable of carrying several hundred tons of grain, and the journey could take anywhere from a few weeks to over a month, depending on the winds and the weather. The arrival of the grain fleet was an event of great significance, and the Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD, invested heavily in improving the harbor facilities at Ostia to make the unloading process faster and more efficient. He ordered the construction of a new artificial harbor, complete with a lighthouse, modeled on the famous Pharos of Alexandria, and this harbor was later expanded and improved by the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century. From the port, the grain was transferred to smaller boats and barges that carried it up the Tiber to Rome, where it was unloaded at the river docks and stored in the horea until it was needed. The entire supply chain, from the fields of Egypt to the bakeries of Rome, was a remarkable achievement of organization and logistics, and it operated more or less continuously for centuries. It is the kind of thing that is easy to take for granted, but when you stop and think about the sheer scale of it, the number of ships and sailors and dock workers and administrators and bakers involved, it becomes genuinely impressive. Feeding a city of 1 million people in an age before refrigeration, before railroads, before any of the modern technologies we rely on for food distribution, was an extraordinary accomplishment. But bread and porridge were only the beginning. The Roman diet, particularly for those who could afford it, included a wide range of other foods. Olive oil was ubiquitous, used for cooking, for dressing salads and vegetables, for preserving food, and even for personal hygiene, since the Romans used oil rather than soap to clean their skin. Olives themselves were eaten at virtually every meal in various preparations, from simple brined olives to more elaborate dishes where they were cooked with herbs and spices. The Romans also consumed large quantities of legumes, particularly lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans, which were cheap, nutritious, and easy to store. Vegetables such as cabbage, lettuce, onions, garlic, leeks, and turnips were common, as were various fruits, including grapes, figs, dates, apples, and pears. Meat was available, but was not consumed in the quantities that we might expect. For the average Roman, meat was something of a luxury, eaten on special occasions or purchased from street vendors who sold cooked sausages and stews from small shops and stalls. Pork was the most common meat, followed by lamb and goat. Beef was relatively rare because cattle were more valuable as draft animals than as food. Poultry, including chicken and goose, was available, as was game such as wild boar, deer, and rabbit, though these were more commonly associated with the tables of the wealthy. Fish and seafood were important components of the diet, particularly in coastal areas and in Rome itself, where fresh fish could be obtained from the river or from the coast. The Romans were enthusiastic consumers of oysters, mussels, shrimp, octopus, and a wide variety of fish, from humble sardines and anchovies to prized specimens such as mullet and turbot. And then there was garum. Garum was a fermented fish sauce that was arguably the single most important condiment in all of Roman cooking, and it deserves a moment of our time because it is such a peculiar and fascinating product. Garum was made by layering fish, typically small oily fish like anchovies or mackerel, with large quantities of salt in stone or ceramic vats, and then leaving the mixture to ferment in the sun for weeks or even months. As the fish broke down, they released a rich, pungent, intensely savory liquid that was strained off and bottled. This liquid was garum, and it was used in almost everything. It was added to sauces, poured over vegetables, mixed into marinades, drizzled on bread, and stirred into stews. To the modern palate, the idea of fermented fish sauce might sound unpleasant, but if you have ever used Thai fish sauce or Vietnamese nuoc mam, you have tasted something very similar. These modern Asian fish sauces are made by essentially the same process and serve the same culinary purpose, adding depth, saltiness, and that elusive quality known as umami to whatever they touch. Garum was produced on an industrial scale in factories located along the coasts of Spain, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, and it was one of the most widely traded commodities in the Roman world. Different regions were known for producing different grades and varieties, and the finest garum, known as garum sociorum, was made in the Spanish city of Carthago Nova, modern-day Cartagena, and could fetch extraordinary prices. It was traded in distinctive narrow-necked amphorae, those elongated clay jars that are one of the most recognizable artifacts of Roman commerce, and fragments of these amphorae have been found at archaeological sites from Britain to India, testifying to the truly global reach of Roman trade networks. The production of garum must have been an enormously smelly business. The factories were typically located outside the main residential areas of their host cities, for obvious reasons, and ancient sources occasionally mention the powerful odor that emanated from them. But the Romans did not seem to mind, or at least they did not mind enough to stop consuming the product in vast quantities. It was simply part of life, as unremarkable and as essential as bread or olive oil. Now, while we are on the subject of food, it would be remiss not to mention the Roman banquet, or convivium, because the elaborate dinner parties of the Roman elite are among the most vivid and well-documented aspects of Roman social life. A Roman banquet was much more than just a meal. It was a social event, a display of wealth and taste, a forum for conversation and entertainment, and a carefully choreographed performance that reflected and reinforced the social hierarchies of Roman society. A formal banquet was held in the triclinium, a dining room named for the three large couches, or triclinia, that were arranged in a U shape around a central table. Guests reclined on these couches, propping themselves up on their left elbows and eating with their right hands, a posture that strikes us as awkward, but which the Romans found perfectly comfortable and civilized. The arrangement of guests on the couches was not random, but followed a strict protocol based on social rank, with the most honored guest occupying a specific position on the middle couch, known as the locus consularis. The meal itself was divided into 3 courses. The first course, the gustaccio, consisted of appetizers designed to stimulate the appetite, things like eggs, olives, salads, small portions of seafood, and perhaps a few slices of sausage or cheese. The second course, the prima mensa, was the main event, and it could be spectacularly elaborate, with multiple dishes of meat, fish, and poultry, accompanied by sauces and vegetables. The third course, the secunda mensa, was dessert, which might include fruits, nuts, pastries, and sweet cakes. Wine was served throughout the meal, mixed with water according to a ratio determined by the host or by a designated master of ceremonies called the arbiter bibendi, the judge of drinking. The most extravagant Roman banquets, as described by writers like Petronius in his novel The Satyricon, could be almost absurdly over the top, featuring dozens of courses, elaborate presentation, live entertainment, and dishes designed more to astonish than to nourish. Petronius describes a fictional banquet hosted by a vulgar nouveau riche character named Trimalchio, at which the food includes a whole roasted boar stuffed with live thrushes, pastry eggs containing tiny cooked songbirds, and a hare decorated with wings to resemble Pegasus. Whether real Roman banquets ever reached quite this level of theatrical excess is debatable, but the Satyricon was clearly exaggerating tendencies that existed in real life, and there are enough other accounts of lavish dining to suggest that some wealthy Romans did indeed push the boundaries of culinary extravagance to extraordinary lengths. But for most people, most of the time, dining was a far simpler affair. The typical Roman ate a light breakfast, the ientaculum, which might consist of nothing more than a piece of bread, perhaps dipped in wine or drizzled with honey, and maybe a few olives or a bit of cheese. Lunch, the prandium, was also light, often just bread and cold leftovers from the previous evening, eaten quickly and without much ceremony. The main meal of the day was dinner, the cena, which was eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, and could range from a simple one-course affair for ordinary people to the multi-course extravaganzas we have just described for the wealthy. And so, gently, we have made our way from the shaded seats of the Colosseum to the reclining couches of the triclinium, from the roar of the crowd to the quiet clink of wine cups, from the grand public spectacle to the intimate private dinner. The thread connecting these things is the thread of Roman social life, the elaborate, carefully maintained system of customs and hierarchies and mutual obligations that governed how people interacted with one another, how they displayed their status, and how they understood their place in the world. And this thread has many more strands for us to follow, many more quiet corridors for us to wander through, many more gently tedious details for us to absorb as we drift slowly, peacefully towards sleep. Let us continue, then, along these quiet corridors, moving softly through the fabric of Roman daily life, where the customs and habits of ordinary people unfolded in patterns that were at once remarkably structured and deeply familiar. We have spoken of the grand spectacles and the lavish banquets, and now we might turn our attention to something rather more mundane, something quieter and more repetitive, which is the matter of how Romans dressed themselves each morning, how they chose their garments, and what those garments meant within the intricate system of social signaling that permeated every aspect of their existence. The toga, that most famous of Roman garments, was in many ways the least comfortable piece of clothing ever devised by a civilization that prided itself on engineering and practical solutions. It was, at its most basic, a large, semicircular piece of wool, typically about 18 feet long and perhaps 6 feet wide, which had to be draped around the body in a very specific manner. The process of putting on a toga was not something a person could easily do alone. Most Romans of any standing required the assistance of a slave or a family member to arrange the heavy fabric correctly, folding it just so, draping it over the left shoulder, bringing it under the right arm, and then casting it back over the left shoulder again, all while ensuring that the folds fell in the proper cascading arrangement that indicated one knew how to wear a toga, which was itself a marker of social competence and respectability. The toga was, in the strictest sense, the garment of the Roman citizen. Non-citizens were not permitted to wear it, and women, with certain unfortunate exceptions we need not dwell upon, did not wear it either. It was heavy, it was hot in summer, it restricted movement considerably, and it required constant adjustment throughout the day to prevent it from slipping or bunching in unflattering ways. And yet, for all its impracticality, the toga was considered absolutely essential for any formal occasion. A Roman citizen appearing in the forum, attending a religious ceremony, visiting a patron, or conducting any official business was expected to wear his toga, and to wear it properly. To appear in public without one, in merely a tunic, was considered a mark of lower status, of someone who worked with his hands and could not afford the luxury of being encumbered by yards of draped wool. The color and decoration of the toga further communicated one's place in the social order, and these distinctions were observed with the kind of meticulous attention that might strike us as excessive, but which, to the Romans, seemed perfectly natural and necessary. The ordinary citizen wore the toga virilis, which was plain, undyed wool of an off-white or cream color. Candidates for political office wore the toga candida, which had been bleached to a brilliant white using chalk or sulfur. And from this practice we derive our modern word candidate, though the connection between chalk-whitened wool and contemporary political campaigns is perhaps not immediately obvious. Senators and certain magistrates wore the toga praetexta, which featured a purple stripe along its border, and this small strip of expensive dye was enough to set its wearer apart and above the common crowd. The most elaborate toga of all was the toga picta, which was entirely purple and embroidered with gold, and this was reserved for generals celebrating a triumph, and later, for the emperors themselves. The production of these garments, particularly those involving purple dye, was a matter of considerable expense and effort. The famous Tyrian purple, the most prized of all ancient dyes, was derived from the mucus glands of certain species of predatory sea snails, primarily the Murex brandaris and the Murex trunculus, which were harvested in enormous quantities along the coasts of Phoenicia. The process of extracting the dye was laborious and, by all accounts, extraordinarily unpleasant from an olfactory standpoint. The snails were crushed, their glandular secretions collected, and the resulting liquid was left to putrefy in large stone vats for several days under the sun. The stench produced by this process was so overpowering that dye works were invariably located far from residential areas, downwind of the city, and ancient authors describe the smell as being among the most offensive things one could encounter in the Mediterranean world. And yet, the resulting dye, once the chemical transformation was complete, produced a color of such richness and permanence that it became synonymous with wealth, power, and imperial authority. Beneath the toga, Romans wore a tunic, which was the basic everyday garment for people of all classes and both sexes. The tunic was a simple rectangle of cloth, folded over and sewn at the sides, with openings for the head and arms, and it was belted at the waist. For most ordinary Romans, the tunic was the primary garment, and many people, particularly those engaged in manual labor, wore nothing else. Working men often wore their tunics short, above the knee, while men of higher status wore theirs somewhat longer, and the length of one's tunic was yet another of those small, carefully calibrated signals by which Romans communicated their social position to one another without needing to say a word. Women's dress followed its own set of conventions, equally codified and equally laden with social meaning. The primary garment for a respectable Roman matron was the stola, a long, sleeveless dress worn over a tunic which reached to the feet and was often belted beneath the breasts and again at the waist. Over the stola, a woman might wear a palla, a large rectangular shawl that could be draped over the head when outdoors, providing both modesty and protection from the sun. The stola was specifically the garment of the married woman, the matrona, and wearing it was both a privilege and a statement. It declared that its wearer was a respectable wife and mother, a woman of standing in the community, and its absence could be read as a comment upon one's moral character, though the reality of Roman women's lives was, of course, far more complex and varied than any single garment could express. The materials from which these garments were made varied enormously according to wealth and status. Wool was by far the most common fabric in the Roman world, and most ordinary clothing was made from it. Linen, imported primarily from Egypt, was used for lighter garments and underclothing and was considered somewhat luxurious. Silk, which arrived in Rome via the extraordinarily long trade routes from China, was fabulously expensive and was regarded by Roman moralists as dangerously decadent, a symptom of the softness and moral decline that they believed was always threatening to undermine the stern virtues of their ancestors. The elder Pliny complained about the vast sums of money that flowed eastward each year to pay for silk, pepper, and other luxuries, and conservative Romans were forever lamenting the extravagance of their contemporaries, though these lamentations seem to have had very little practical effect on anyone's purchasing habits. And while we are on the subject of daily routines and personal presentation, we might as well follow the Roman citizen through the rest of his morning, after he has been helped into his toga and has eaten a light breakfast, which typically consisted of bread, perhaps dipped in wine or olive oil, with some cheese or fruit. The Roman day was divided into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. But because these hours were determined by the actual length of the day, they varied considerably depending on the season. A summer hour was considerably longer than a winter hour, and a winter night considerably longer than a summer night. This system, which seems impractical to us, was perfectly adequate for a society in which most activities were governed by natural light, rather than by the precise timekeeping that modern life demands. The morning hours were typically devoted to the salutatio, a ritual that was central to the Roman system of patronage and social obligation. Clients, who were men of lower status who had attached themselves to a wealthy and powerful patron, would rise early and make their way through the streets to their patron's house, where they would gather in the atrium and wait to be received. They came to pay their respects, to receive their patron's greetings, and, in many cases, to collect the sportula, a small gift of food or money that the patron distributed to his clients as part of their reciprocal relationship. The patron, in return, gained prestige from the number and quality of his clients, who would accompany him through the streets, swelling his entourage and demonstrating his influence and importance to anyone who happened to be watching. This daily ritual could be tedious and humiliating for the clients, who might have to wait for considerable periods in uncomfortable conditions, endure the condescension of the patron's household slaves, and compete with one another for attention and favor. The satirist Martial, who was himself a client dependent upon the goodwill of various patrons, wrote extensively and bitterly about the indignities of the salutatio, the cold early mornings trudging through muddy streets in a freshly cleaned toga, the long waits, the disappointing sportula, and the general sense of being at the mercy of someone else's schedule and mood. And yet the system persisted, because it served the needs of both parties, binding them together in a web of mutual obligation that was fundamental to how Roman society organized itself. After the salutatio, the patron might proceed to the forum, accompanied by his retinue of clients, to conduct business, attend to legal matters, or simply be seen. The Forum Romanum, that famous open space at the heart of Rome, was the center of public life, a place where business, politics, religion, and socializing all overlapped and intermixed. Here one could find law courts in session, with advocates delivering lengthy speeches on behalf of their clients, bankers and money changers conducting their transactions from their tabernae along the edges of the square, priests performing rituals at the various temples that surrounded the space, politicians canvassing for votes or posting public notices, and ordinary citizens simply milling about, meeting friends, exchanging gossip, and observing the endless theater of public life. The noise of the forum must have been considerable. Ancient sources describe a constant hubbub of voices, the shouts of vendors and hawkers, the cries of beggars, the formal rhetoric of orators competing with the informal chatter of bystanders. And beyond the forum, the streets of Rome themselves were noisy, crowded, and often chaotic. The city, at the height of the empire, had a population that may have approached or exceeded 1 million people, all crammed into a relatively small area, living in conditions that ranged from the spacious luxury of senatorial townhouses on the Palatine Hill to the cramped, dangerous squalor of the multi-story apartment blocks, or insulae, that housed the majority of the urban poor. These insulae were a defining feature of the Roman urban landscape, and they deserve a few moments of our quiet attention. They were typically constructed of timber and brick, rising to 5, 6, or even 7 stories, and they were notorious for their poor construction, their susceptibility to fire, and their general unpleasantness as places to live. The ground floor was often occupied by shops or taverns, while the upper floors were divided into small apartments of varying sizes. The most desirable apartments were on the lower floors, where one did not have to climb so many stairs, and where the construction was generally more solid. The higher one went, the smaller and more precarious the rooms became, and the residents of the topmost floors lived in conditions of genuine hardship, with little light, poor ventilation, no running water, and the constant fear that the entire building might collapse or catch fire. Fire was, indeed, one of the great terrors of life in ancient Rome. The combination of timber construction, open flames for cooking and lighting, and the extreme density of the housing stock meant that fires were frequent and often devastating. Augustus established the vigiles, a corps of freedmen who served as both firefighters and night watchmen, and they patrolled the streets with buckets, axes, and pumps, but their efforts were often inadequate against a fire that had taken hold in the narrow, crowded streets of the city. The Great Fire of 64 AD, which occurred during the reign of Nero, burned for 6 days and devastated large portions of the city. And while the exact cause of the fire remains debated by historians, its scale and destructiveness were a vivid illustration of the vulnerability of the urban environment. After the fire, Nero implemented new building regulations designed to reduce the risk of future conflagrations. Streets were widened, building heights were restricted, and the use of fireproof materials was encouraged. But the pressures of a growing population and the economics of urban housing meant that these regulations were not always strictly enforced, and the insulae continued to be built in much the same way as before, a reality that speaks to the eternal tension between safety regulations and economic necessity that is familiar to us even today. Water supply was another matter of considerable importance in the daily life of Rome, and it is here that we encounter one of the most impressive achievements of Roman engineering, the aqueduct system. Rome was eventually served by 11 major aqueducts, which together brought approximately 1 million cubic meters of water into the city every day. This water supplied the public baths, the fountains, the latrines, and, for those wealthy enough to afford a private connection, individual homes. The engineering required to build and maintain these aqueducts was extraordinary. They followed precise gradients, sometimes running for many miles across the countryside, carried on the famous arched bridges when they needed to cross valleys, tunneled through hills, and regulated by an elaborate system of distribution tanks and pipes within the city itself. Sextus Julius Frontinus, who served as curator aquarum, or superintendent of aqueducts, under the Emperor Nerva at the end of the 1st century AD, wrote a detailed treatise on the water supply of Rome, in which he described the technical specifications of each aqueduct, the volume of water each carried, and the various administrative and engineering challenges involved in maintaining the system. His work is a fascinating document, combining practical engineering knowledge with bureaucratic diligence, and it gives us an unusually detailed picture of how the Romans managed one of the essential services of urban life. Frontinus took evident pride in the aqueduct system, comparing it favorably to the pyramids of Egypt and the temples of Greece, and arguing that the practical utility of Roman waterworks was a more worthy achievement than the merely ornamental grandeur of those other monuments. The water brought by the aqueducts was distributed throughout the city to public fountains, which were located at regular intervals along the streets and which served as the primary source of water for most of the urban population. Residents of the insulae, who had no private water supply, would send slaves or go themselves to fill jugs and amphorae at these fountains, and the fountains served as gathering places and landmarks in the neighborhoods they served. The sound of flowing water was a constant backdrop to Roman urban life, and the fountains, large and small, were among the most familiar and essential features of the cityscape. And from the fountains, the water flowed onward, through the drains and sewers that carried waste away from the streets and into the Tiber. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer of Rome, was originally constructed in the 6th or 7th century BC to drain the marshy valley that would become the Forum, and over the centuries it was extended and elaborated into a vast underground network that served as the city's primary drainage system. It was large enough, in places, to accommodate a boat, and its arched stone channels were among the most enduring pieces of Roman infrastructure, some of which remain in use in modified form to this day. These systems of supply and drainage, of construction and regulation, of morning routines and daily obligations, all formed the quiet, repetitive infrastructure of Roman life, the background against which the more dramatic events of history unfolded. And it is in these details, these small and seemingly insignificant matters of how people dressed and ate and washed and moved through their days, that we find the truest picture of what it was like to live in the ancient world, a picture that is at once foreign and familiar, strange and comforting, and well suited to accompany us as we settle deeper into our pillows and let the quiet rhythm of these facts carry us gently toward rest. And so we continue our quiet journey through the daily textures of Roman life, moving now from the pipes and aqueducts and bathhouses into the broader world of Roman entertainment, a subject that, despite its reputation for spectacle and violence, contains within it a great many small and unremarkable details that are perfectly suited to our purposes here this evening. For even the most dramatic events, when examined closely enough, dissolve into logistics and schedules and ordinary human concerns that are, in their own way, deeply soothing to consider. The Roman Colosseum, known more properly as the Flavian Amphitheater, was commissioned by the Emperor Vespasian around the year 70 of the Common Era and completed under his son Titus approximately a decade later. It could hold, by most estimates, somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, though the precise number depends on how one calculates the seating and whether one includes those who stood in the uppermost galleries, where the view was poor and the seats, such as they were, amounted to little more than standing room along wooden platforms. The structure itself was built of travertine limestone, volcanic rock, and concrete, and it rose to a height of approximately 150 feet, which is roughly equivalent to a modern 12-story building, though such comparisons are imperfect and serve only to give a general sense of scale. The events held within the Colosseum followed a surprisingly predictable daily schedule, one that was repeated with minor variations across the many days of games that were held throughout the year. The morning typically began with animal hunts, known as venationes, in which trained hunters called venatores would pursue and kill various animals that had been brought from across the empire and beyond. These animals included lions, bears, leopards, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, ostriches, deer, and a wide variety of other creatures, some of which were familiar to the Roman audience, and some of which were exotic curiosities seen for the first time. The logistics of acquiring, transporting, housing, and feeding these animals before their appearance in the arena was an enormous undertaking that involved networks of trappers, shippers, handlers, and caretakers spread across North Africa, the Near East, and other distant regions. The animals were kept in underground chambers beneath the arena floor, a complex subterranean network known as the hypogeum, which consisted of tunnels, corridors, cages, and an elaborate system of lifts and trapdoors operated by pulleys, counterweights, and the labor of many workers. These lifts could raise animals and scenery to the arena floor with surprising speed, creating the impression that creatures had appeared from nowhere, which added to the theatrical effect of the spectacles. The hypogeum was not part of the original construction, but was added later, during the reign of Domitian, and its construction meant that the arena could no longer be flooded for the naval battles, or naumachii, that had been staged during the earlier years of the amphitheater's existence, though some scholars debate this point and suggest that limited flooding may still have been possible in certain sections. The midday period was often reserved for public executions, which were considered the least prestigious part of the day's programming, and were attended primarily by those of lower social standing, as many wealthier spectators used this interval to leave for lunch. The executions took various forms, some of which were staged as mythological reenactments, in which condemned criminals were forced to play the roles of characters from Greek and Roman myths who met violent ends, such as Orpheus being torn apart by animals or Icarus falling from a great height. These were grim affairs, certainly, but they were presented with elaborate costumes, scenery, and stage machinery, blurring the line between punishment and performance in a way that strikes the modern mind as deeply unsettling, but which the Romans, or at least many of them, accepted as a normal part of civic life. The afternoon was reserved for the gladiatorial combats themselves, which were the main attraction and the reason most spectators had come. Contrary to the popular image of gladiatorial combat as an unregulated bloodbath, these fights were in fact governed by a complex set of rules and conventions, overseen by a referee called a summa rudis, who carried a wooden staff and could intervene to separate the fighters, call pauses, or enforce the regulations that governed each type of match. Gladiators were classified into various types based on their armor, weapons, and fighting style, and the pairings were carefully arranged to create interesting and, in theory, fair contests, though in practice some matchups were decidedly unequal, a fact that was understood and even appreciated by the audience, who enjoyed seeing how a fighter with certain advantages would fare against one with different strengths. Among the most common gladiatorial types was the murmillo, who carried a large rectangular shield, a short sword called a gladius, and wore a helmet with a distinctive fish-shaped crest. The murmillo was typically paired against the thrax, or Thracian, who carried a smaller rectangular shield and a curved sword called a sica, and who wore greaves on both legs to compensate for the reduced protection offered by the smaller shield. Another common type was the retiarius, who fought with a weighted net, a trident, and a small dagger, and who wore very little armor, relying instead on speed and agility. The retiarius was traditionally paired against the secutor, whose smooth, rounded helmet was specifically designed to prevent the net from catching on any protrusion, giving the secutor an advantage in escaping the retiarius's primary weapon, but limiting visibility and airflow through very small eye holes that made the helmet hot and claustrophobic to wear. These pairings were not random, but were based on a long tradition of matching fighters whose equipment created a balance of offensive and defensive capabilities, so that a fighter with greater protection might face one with greater mobility, or one with a long-range weapon might face one with a shorter but more versatile armament. The specifics of these pairings evolved over time, and there were many regional and temporal variations that are not always well documented, but the general principle of asymmetric balance remained consistent throughout the centuries of gladiatorial combat. The gladiators themselves came from a variety of backgrounds. Many were prisoners of war, slaves, or condemned criminals who had been sentenced to the arena, but a significant number were free volunteers, known as octorati, who had willingly signed contracts with the managers of gladiatorial schools, called lanistae, in exchange for payment, housing, food, and medical care. The reasons for volunteering varied and included debt, poverty, the desire for fame, and, in some cases, what appears to have been genuine enthusiasm for the profession. The contracts were legally binding and placed the volunteer under the authority of the lanista for a specified period, during which the gladiator was, in effect, a form of bonded laborer whose body and services belonged to his employer. The training schools, or ludi, were substantial establishments with their own barracks, training grounds, armories, medical facilities, and kitchens. The largest and most famous was the Ludus Magnus, which was located near the Colosseum and connected to it by an underground passage. Archaeological evidence and ancient sources suggest that gladiators received a diet heavy in barley and beans, which provided the carbohydrates and protein needed to build a layer of subcutaneous fat that served as a form of natural padding, protecting vital organs and blood vessels from superficial cuts during combat. This dietary regimen gave gladiators a heavier, less muscular appearance than is often depicted in modern films and artwork, a detail that is interesting precisely because it is so mundane and practical. Medical care for gladiators was remarkably advanced by ancient standards, and the physician Galen, one of the most important medical writers of antiquity, spent several years early in his career tending to gladiators at a school in Pergamum, where he gained valuable experience in treating wounds, setting bones, and studying anatomy. The investment in gladiatorial health and training was substantial, and the death of a gladiator represented a significant financial loss for his owner, which is one reason why gladiatorial combats were not always fought to the death, despite the popular perception. Many bouts ended with the submission of one fighter, who would signal his defeat by raising a finger, at which point the editor, or sponsor of the games, would decide whether the defeated fighter should be spared or killed, often taking into account the wishes of the crowd, though the editor was not strictly obligated to follow popular opinion. The question of how often gladiatorial combats ended in death is one that historians have debated at length, and the estimates vary considerably depending on the period, the type of event, and the sources consulted. Some scholars have estimated that the mortality rate for gladiators in any given bout was somewhere around 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 during certain periods, while others have argued for higher rates, particularly during the earlier and later periods of the games. What is clear is that the rate was not uniform and changed over time, influenced by economic considerations, imperial policy, and shifting public tastes. Beyond the gladiatorial combats and animal hunts, the Colosseum and other amphitheaters hosted a variety of other events that are less well known but equally interesting in their details. There were displays of trained animals performing tricks, exhibitions of unusual or exotic creatures, acrobatic performances, and what might be described as theatrical productions involving elaborate scenery and stage effects. The Romans were remarkably skilled at creating visual spectacles, and the arena could be transformed to represent forests, lakes, mountains, and other landscapes using movable scenery, painted backdrops, and the mechanical apparatus of the hypogeum. The seating in the Colosseum was arranged according to a strict social hierarchy, with the best seats, closest to the arena, reserved for senators and other high-ranking officials, and the worst seats, at the very top, assigned to women and the lowest social classes. The emperor had a special box known as the pulvinar, or the imperial box, which was positioned to provide an excellent view of the action while also being visible to the entire audience. Allows the emperor to be seen, and to be seen reacting to the events below, which was an important aspect of the political theater that the games represented. The seating sections were divided by barriers and accessed through a system of numbered arches and internal corridors that allowed the enormous crowds to enter and exit the building with remarkable efficiency, a design principle that has influenced the construction of stadiums and arenas to the present day. Tickets for the games were not purchased in the modern sense, but were distributed in the form of small tokens, or tesserae, made of bone or clay, which were inscribed with section and seat numbers. These tokens were distributed through various channels, including direct patronage from wealthy individuals, allocation through civic organizations, and distribution by the emperor or the sponsor of the games as a form of public generosity. The system was not perfectly equitable, and access to the best seats depended heavily on social status and connections. But the general principle was that the games were a public benefit available to all citizens. The awning system, known as the velarium, was another remarkable feature of the Colosseum that deserves mention for its ingenuity. This was an enormous, retractable canvas awning that could be extended over the seating areas to provide shade from the sun, and it was operated by a detachment of sailors from the Roman fleet stationed at Misenum, who were specially trained in the rigging and handling of the large canvas panels. The velarium did not cover the arena floor itself, but shielded the spectators, and its deployment required the coordinated effort of hundreds of men working ropes and pulleys in a manner similar to the handling of sails on a large ship. The masts and rigging for the velarium were supported by brackets set into the uppermost level of the Colosseum's exterior wall, the sockets for which are still visible today. The frequency of games varied considerably throughout Roman history. During the Republic, gladiatorial combats were relatively infrequent and were typically associated with funeral rites held in honor of deceased prominent citizens as a way of commemorating their memory and displaying the wealth and generosity of their families. Over time, the games became increasingly elaborate and frequent, and by the imperial period, they had evolved into a major form of public entertainment and political tool, with emperors competing to outdo their predecessors in the scale and extravagance of the spectacles they provided. The Emperor Trajan, to celebrate his victories in the Dacian Wars, is reported to have sponsored games lasting 123 days, involving some 10,000 gladiators and 11,000 animals, though these numbers come from ancient sources that may have been prone to exaggeration. The cost of staging these events was enormous and represented a significant portion of public and private expenditure. The animals alone were fantastically expensive, particularly the more exotic species, which had to be captured alive, transported over long distances by land and sea, and maintained in captivity until the day of their appearance. The gladiators, too, represented a considerable investment, and the rental fees charged by lanistae for their fighters could be substantial. The scenery, machinery, costumes, and other production elements added further to the expense, and the provision of free food and drink to spectators, which was customary at many events, contributed additional costs. Beyond Rome itself, amphitheaters were built throughout the empire, from Britain to North Africa to the eastern provinces, and gladiatorial games and animal hunts were staged in cities and towns of all sizes, though naturally on a smaller and less extravagant scale than in the capital. The amphitheater at El Jem in modern Tunisia, for example, could hold approximately 35,000 spectators, while smaller amphitheaters in provincial towns might accommodate only a few thousand. These provincial games served many of the same social and political functions as those in Rome, providing entertainment, reinforcing social hierarchies, and offering local elites an opportunity to display their generosity and compete for public favor. The decline of gladiatorial combat was gradual and resulted from a combination of factors, including the spread of Christianity, whose leaders generally opposed the games on moral grounds, the increasing cost of staging the events as the empire's finances deteriorated, and changing public tastes. The last recorded gladiatorial combat in Rome is traditionally dated to the year 404 of the Common Era, though animal hunts continued for another century or so after that. The Colosseum itself continued to be used for various purposes in the centuries that followed, serving at different times as a quarry for building materials, a fortress, a chapel, and even a site for small-scale manufacturing, before eventually being recognized as the historical monument it is today. And now, having spent some time in the arena, we might turn our attention to quieter forms of Roman entertainment, for the Romans were not solely devoted to the spectacles of the amphitheater. The theater was an important part of Roman cultural life, and performances of comedies, tragedies, mimes, and pantomimes were staged regularly throughout the year in dedicated theater buildings, as well as in temporary structures erected for specific occasions. The plays of Plautus and Terence, which were adapted from earlier Greek originals, were among the most popular theatrical works of the Republican period, and their influence on later European comedy, particularly through their use of stock characters, mistaken identities, and elaborate plots involving separated twins, scheming slaves, and frustrated lovers, has been both profound and enduring. Extending through the Renaissance and into the modern era, a quiet thread of continuity connecting the ancient world to our own. The amphitheater itself, that most distinctive of Roman architectural forms, deserves some further consideration as we settle into this final portion of our exploration. For the structure was not merely a building, but a kind of social organism, a place where the various strata of Roman society were arranged in careful, visible order, each group assigned to its proper section according to rank, wealth, and civic standing, so that the amphitheater became a kind of living diagram of the Roman social hierarchy, rendered in stone and bodies, and the slow shuffling of thousands of feet finding their appointed seats. The best seats, those closest to the arena floor, were reserved for senators and other high-ranking officials who sat on broad, cushioned benches with excellent sight lines, while the equestrian class occupied the rows just behind them, and ordinary citizens filled the middle tiers, and women, with the exception of the Vestal virgins who enjoyed privileged seating near the front, were generally relegated to the uppermost sections, the farthest from the action, where the figures in the arena must have appeared quite small and the details of combat somewhat difficult to discern. Slaves and foreigners, when they were permitted entry at all, occupied the very highest and least desirable positions, standing room in many cases, pressed against the outer wall of the structure beneath the great canvas awning that was sometimes stretched across the top of the amphitheater to provide shade from the Mediterranean sun. This awning, known as the velarium, was itself a remarkable feat of engineering, a vast expanse of fabric that could be extended and retracted by teams of sailors from the Roman Navy, who were specially detailed for this purpose because of their expertise in handling ropes and rigging, and who were stationed at the Colosseum during major spectacles to manage this enormous canopy, which shaded the audience from the heat while leaving the arena floor itself exposed to the open sky. The logistics involved in operating the velarium were considerable. Requires a complex system of ropes, pulleys, and masts that were anchored to the uppermost level of the amphitheater's exterior wall, and the coordination necessary to deploy this massive shade structure smoothly and efficiently speaks to the organizational capabilities that the Romans brought to bear on even the most seemingly peripheral aspects of their public entertainments. The seating arrangements in the amphitheater were not merely a matter of custom or convenience, but were codified in law, particularly under Augustus, whose legislation regarding public spectacles formalized what had previously been a more informal system of social segregation, establishing precise rules about who could sit where and under what circumstances, and even specifying the types of clothing that spectators were expected to wear, with citizens required to don the toga, that cumbersome and impractical garment that was nonetheless the symbol of Roman civic identity, and which must have made for a rather uncomfortable experience during long hours spent sitting in the sun watching gladiatorial combat or wild animal hunts unfold on the sandy floor below. The enforcement of these seating regulations was the responsibility of designated officials who checked tokens or tickets, known as tesserae, which were small ceramic or bone tablets inscribed with information about the spectator's assigned section, row, and seat, a system not unlike the ticketing arrangements of modern sporting events and concert venues, though considerably less susceptible to the problems of scalping and counterfeiting that plague contemporary entertainment. The spectacles themselves were organized and funded by a variety of sponsors, ranging from the emperor himself, who used the games as a means of demonstrating his generosity and maintaining popular support, to wealthy private citizens seeking political advancement or social prestige, to magistrates fulfilling the obligations of their office. For the provision of public entertainment was considered one of the duties of those who held positions of authority in Roman government, and the quality and lavishness of the games one sponsored could have a significant impact on one's political fortunes and social reputation. The cost of staging a full program of gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, and other entertainments was enormous, encompassing not only the purchase or rental of gladiators from the various training schools, the acquisition of exotic animals from distant provinces and foreign lands, the construction of elaborate stage sets and mechanical devices for the arena, and the provision of food and drink for the audience. but also the bribes, gifts, and gratuities that were customarily distributed to the crowd in the form of tokens redeemable for various prizes, a practice known as the sparsio, during which wooden balls or other small objects inscribed with the names of prizes were thrown into the audience, creating a scramble among the spectators that was itself a form of entertainment for those watching from the more comfortable seats below. The unfairness of the matches that took place in the arena was, as we have discussed at some length, a feature rather than a flaw of the system, reflecting the Roman understanding of spectacle as a demonstration of power, hierarchy, and the consequences of transgression, rather than a sporting contest between equals. The condemned criminals who were led into the arena to face wild beasts or armed gladiators without weapons or armor of their own were not meant to have a fighting chance, for their deaths were intended as a form of public punishment, a vivid and terrifying reminder to the assembled crowd of the fate that awaited those who violated the laws and norms of Roman society. These executions, which typically took place during the midday interval between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon gladiatorial combats, were often staged as elaborate theatrical productions, with the condemned forced to reenact scenes from mythology or history that ended in the death of the protagonist. So that a prisoner might be cast as Orpheus, torn apart by wild animals in a carefully choreographed scene set amidst artificial trees and mechanical devices that created the illusion of a pastoral landscape. Or as Icarus, launched into the air by some mechanical contrivance only to fall to the arena floor. Or as Hercules, consumed by flames on a pyre erected in the center of the arena, the boundary between theater and execution dissolving entirely in these grim performances that combined artistic ambition with casual brutality in a manner that strikes the modern sensibility as deeply disturbing, but that was accepted, even appreciated, by the Roman audience as an appropriate and entertaining use of human lives that had been deemed forfeit by the state. The animal hunts, or venationes, which formed another major component of the amphitheater program, involved the slaughter of enormous numbers of wild animals, including lions, leopards, bears, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, ostriches, and various species of deer and wild cattle, which were captured in Africa, Asia, and the frontier regions of the empire and transported to Rome at great expense and with considerable difficulty. The logistics of moving large predators across thousands of miles of land and sea being a challenge that required specialized knowledge, equipment, and personnel, including the hunters who captured the animals, the handlers who fed and cared for them during their journey, the sailors who transported them by ship, and the arena staff who managed them once they arrived at the amphitheater, housing them in underground chambers and pens beneath the arena floor, and releasing them through trapdoors and ramps when their moment in the spectacle arrived. The scale of this enterprise was staggering, with individual games sometimes involving the killing of hundreds or even thousands of animals over a period of several days, and the cumulative impact of centuries of such spectacles on wildlife populations in North Africa and the Near East was significant, contributing to the local extinction of several species, including the North African elephant, the Barbary lion, and the Atlas bear, populations that were hunted to the point of no return to satisfy the Roman appetite for exotic animal spectacles. The men who fought these animals, the venatores and bestiarii, occupied a social position somewhat different from that of the gladiators who fought in the afternoon combats. For while gladiatorial combat was governed by elaborate rules and traditions and carried with it a certain grudging respect, the animal hunts were considered a somewhat lower form of entertainment, and the men who participated in them were generally regarded as being of lesser status, though skilled venatores could achieve considerable fame and popularity with the crowd, and some became quite wealthy through their exploits, a reminder that Roman social attitudes toward the performers in the arena were complex and sometimes contradictory, combining contempt for their legal status as infames, persons of diminished civic standing, with admiration for their physical courage and skill. Beyond the amphitheater, Roman culture and society encompassed a vast range of activities, institutions, and practices that shaped the daily lives of the empire's inhabitants in ways both large and small. The Roman system of roads, for instance, which extended across the entire empire in a network of paved highways connecting the capital to the most distant provinces, was one of the most impressive achievements of Roman engineering and administration, facilitating the movement of troops, goods, and information across enormous distances with a speed and efficiency that would not be matched in Europe for more than 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire. These roads, many of which were built by the legions themselves as part of their regular duties during periods of relative peace, were constructed according to standardized engineering principles, with foundations of stone and gravel, surfaces of carefully fitted paving stones, and drainage ditches along the sides to prevent water damage, and they were maintained by a system of local and imperial officials who were responsible for ensuring that the roads remained in good repair, a task that was complicated by the sheer scale of the network, which by the height of the empire encompassed some 50,000 miles of paved roads and an even greater mileage of secondary routes and local tracks. The Roman postal system, the cursus publicus, which was established by Augustus and maintained by subsequent emperors, made use of this road network to carry official correspondence and important messages across the empire at remarkable speed, with relay stations positioned at regular intervals along the major routes where fresh horses and riders were kept in readiness, allowing urgent dispatches to travel as much as 50 miles in a single day under favorable conditions, a pace that seems modest by modern standards, but that represented the fastest sustained overland communication speed achievable before the invention of the telegraph in the 19th century. The cursus publicus was reserved for official government use, and private citizens who wished to send letters or messages were obliged to make their own arrangements, typically entrusting their correspondence to travelers, merchants, or servants who happened to be heading in the appropriate direction. A system that was unreliable and slow, but that nonetheless sustained a rich epistolary culture, as evidenced by the thousands of surviving Roman letters, from the polished literary correspondence of Cicero and Pliny the Younger to the humble notes scratched on wooden tablets that have been recovered from military sites along Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. Documents that provide an intimate and often touching glimpse into the everyday concerns of ordinary Romans, their requests for supplies, their complaints about the weather, their invitations to birthday parties, and their expressions of affection for absent friends and family members. The domestic life of the Romans, particularly in the cities, was centered on the household, which was not merely a nuclear family in the modern sense, but an extended social unit that included not only parents and children, but also dependent relatives, freed slaves, servants, clients, and various other individuals who were bound to the head of the household, the paterfamilias, by ties of kinship, obligation, or economic dependence. The paterfamilias exercised considerable authority over the members of his household, including, at least in theory, the power of life and death over his children, though this extreme prerogative was rarely exercised in practice and was increasingly constrained by law and social custom as the Republic gave way to the empire. The Roman house itself, at least among the wealthier classes, was organized around a central atrium, an open or partially covered space that served as the main reception area and social hub of the household, and that typically featured a shallow pool, the impluvium, which collected rainwater from an opening in the roof above, the compluvium, a practical and aesthetically pleasing arrangement that provided the household with a source of fresh water while also admitting light and air into the interior of the building. The walls of Roman houses were frequently decorated with elaborate painted frescoes depicting scenes from mythology, landscapes, architectural vistas, and still-life compositions, executed in a range of styles that art historians have classified into 4 broad chronological periods, each characterized by distinctive techniques and aesthetic preferences. From the relatively simple imitation of marble panels that characterized the earliest phase, to the complex illusionistic compositions of the later periods, which created the impression of windows opening onto imaginary scenes of gardens, harbors, and fantastical architecture, transforming the enclosed spaces of the Roman house into seemingly boundless vistas of beauty and wonder. A quiet triumph of artistic imagination over the physical limitations of brick and plaster that continues to impress and delight visitors to the excavated houses of Pompeii and Herculaneum, those cities frozen in time by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, their streets and buildings preserved beneath layers of volcanic ash and pumice, in a state of remarkable completeness that has made them invaluable sources of information about the material culture and daily life of the Roman world. The floors of these houses were often adorned with mosaics, intricate compositions made from thousands of tiny colored stones or glass pieces called tesserae, arranged in patterns ranging from simple geometric designs to elaborate figurative scenes of exceptional detail and sophistication, including depictions of marine life, hunting scenes, theatrical performances, and portraits, some of which display a level of technical skill and artistic sensitivity that rivals the finest painting. The individual tesserae so small and so precisely placed that the finished image appears almost photographic in its realism, a remarkable achievement considering that each mosaic was assembled entirely by hand, piece by tiny piece, by craftsmen whose names are in most cases lost to history, but whose work has survived the centuries in a condition that allows us to appreciate the patience, skill, and artistic vision that went into their creation. And so we come to the end of our exploration, having wandered through the amphitheaters and theaters, the streets and houses, the roads and postal stations of the Roman world, touching on the spectacles and the social structures, the engineering achievements and the artistic accomplishments, the laws and customs and daily routines that together constituted one of the most complex and fascinating civilizations in human history. The Romans, for all their flaws and all the cruelties that were woven into the fabric of their society, created a world of remarkable richness and variety, a world that has left its mark on virtually every aspect of Western civilization, from our legal systems and governmental institutions to our languages and literatures, our architectural forms and engineering techniques, our ideas about citizenship, public space, and civic responsibility. Their amphitheaters stand in ruins now, the roar of the crowd silenced, the sand of the arena long since swept away by wind and rain. The animals and gladiators and condemned criminals who performed and suffered and died within those walls, reduced to names in ancient texts and images on crumbling mosaics. But the echoes of their world persist, quiet and steady, like the sound of distant footsteps on a Roman road, fading slowly into the gentle stillness of a long and restful night.